And so it is the end of March, and it is already thinking about next school year and funding that. So Mr. Eric, please.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. How's that? Can you see the slide okay? Are you seeing the slides okay? Yeah. Okay, well, it's good to see you all again. As Dr. Harmon mentioned, this is the first of a series of work sessions that we do as part of the budget process, usually starting in March of each year. I have a fair amount of content here, and it was not my intention to go into depth on every single slide. So if I move quickly through a slide and you would like me to go back to it, certainly don't hesitate to suggest that, but I might move through some of these more quickly than others. Okay, did you see that? Are you seeing the changing of the slides? Do you now see presentation outline? No? Okay. Just give me 1 sec if you would. Okay. All right, I can't get it to go to presentation mode, but you can see it.
If you like, Ben, I can do it for you. I don't mind. And you just tell me when to click through. That works.
Okay. Well, can you see what I have? Okay, is that?
It might get a little bit hard to see
okay.
when you get into some of the meat.
All right, let me try one more time, Joel. I'm gonna. It might be if I put it in presentation mode before I actually share my screen. That might be the key.
So Ben, when you put it into presentation mode,
yeah,
at the very bottom of the dots there, one of those will tell you to show your toolbar.
okay. I think I might have just.
And when you do that, then you can put it into. Then you can share your screen and view. So if you go to the 3 dots, it'll say screen and then say show taskbar.
Okay.
So if you put it in PowerPoint in your presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm trying to get back to the screen where it allows me to do that. I think I might be frozen.
Well, it's okay. I can do that. Like I said, I don't mind. So I will.
Yeah, it's not responding to my cursor at this time, Jewel. So would you mind putting it up, and then when my screen responds, we'll go back to me.
Not at all. Just tell me when you're ready to move forward, and I will start sharing the screen now.
So I wasn't even able to unshare, was I?
No, but I think I can take that over.
Okay. Yeah, I'm frozen. Would it be advisable for me to hop off and hop right back on and see if that clears it?
That might be worth you trying, and in the meantime, I'll get it up and
Okay,
started.
I'll try that real quick. If it'll allow me to do that. No, I'm sorry, everybody. I've not had this problem before.
I have. It's okay.
Okay,
That's
if
my
I
daily
vanish-
classroom.
Right,
Like,
it happens all the time. So it's
If
okay.
I vanish, I'm coming right back. Okay.
That's all right. We appreciate that, man. Thank you.
So in the meantime, I think I've started sharing, and you can now see the presentation as Ben gets ready to log back in. But just no.
Not yet.
So on my end, it says that I am screen sharing.
Still
And
Ben's
it's-
screen.
Yeah.
It's still Ben's.
Okay, so maybe he has somehow overridden the system. And
I managed to, here we go.
It's a great picture, by the way.
Okay, there we go. Now, you shouldn't see anything now, right?
nope.
Yes.
We're
Okay, all right, we're gonna give this one more shot. I apologize.
No worries. No worries.
All right, thank you for keeping a sense of humor about this, and don't tell my children.
They will know
Can't-
this is
can't
live and
promise that,
recorded.
Ben.
And so if you start the presentation first, and then like I said, go to the three dots, and when it says screen, go to show taskbar. That way you'll be able to go back into Zoom and share the presentation.
Okay. Moment of truth here. Yes? Yes? Okay, good. I apologize for all of that. Here are at least 6 topics that I wanted to cover today. I'll give you the best legislative update I can give you, although they just released their budgets like, I believe yesterday morning, both Senate and House materials became available. So that's an emerging situation. We'll look at enrollment. We'll talk a little bit about our EP&O levy. We'll talk about status with the CARES Act. And then take a look at the budget development calendar and a list of what I'm calling kind of a longer range budget planning considerations. Okay, so the first thing, which is unexpected and good news, is that I suppose contrary to most of what everybody thought would happen, revenues for the state government continue to greatly exceed original forecasts. And so what you're going to see in the budgets that came out from the legislature are pretty robust budgets that include increases both in federal spending and state spending. So very much an unlikely outcome as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time with you on this chart. I tried to put together a chart that would be a helpful, handy one-pager that summarizes all the information that you really need to know at this point and can know. So you're looking at columns and rows. 3 columns are separated by ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3, right? There have been 3 separate appropriations for ESSER funding. And then the rows indicate first the amounts that we've been informed we will be eligible for. The second row indicates its appropriation status. The third indicates whether we've made any claims on this money. And the fourth begins to discuss the spending restrictions. Although I'll say the fourth row, you could make that several pages of text, but just to summarize a couple of key points. So a couple things I want to point out. If you follow the first row from left to right, I give you an amount at the top that indicates how much we've been informed that we would be eligible for, net of whatever withhold OSPI keeps. So if you all have been following like some of the WASA materials, or maybe WASDA has been sending out materials, if you look at ESSER 2, for example, most of the materials you'll see is like 28.2 million for Kent. It's likely that we'll only access about 25.4 of that because there's a 10% carve out for OSPI. Okay, so I want you to understand why you might see two different numbers. And then the same holds for ESSER 3. The number you typically see is 63.5, but 57.2 is probably the maximum that we'll be able to claim. So subtotaling it all the way across the three columns, you're looking at $89.9 million, which needless to say is a substantial sum of money. So let's talk a little bit about the timing of that and the uses of that. Now we move down the rows. Has it been appropriated by the legislature? ESSER 1 has been appropriated. We've been making claims on that money all year, and I'm going to give you an update about how we've claimed on that in a later slide. ESSER 2 has been appropriated, and we, like a lot of districts, we're just waiting for final approval, subject to the working out the final details of reopening plans, etc. But ESSER 3 has not yet been appropriated. That's a key distinction. So the legislature has not passed a budget that has appropriated that money to OSPI to allocate to school districts. So it's only in theory at this point, and until the law is passed, it is merely just a discussion of how much in theory we have access to, but we can't make any claims on those dollars. Okay. Spending, we have spent almost all of ESSER 1, and will likely have spent all of it by the end of April, and I'll show you a slide here in a second. And then we haven't made any claims on ESSER 2 for the reasons I just mentioned about reopening, and then ESSER 3 again is not real yet. And then spending restrictions, this is important. So technically, if we stagger the revenues strategically, we should be able to claim these dollars all the way out to fiscal year 24, which would be the 23-24 school year. So you see that ESSER 1 needs to be spent by this year, and we'll have no problem doing that. ESSER 2 takes us out to the 22-23 school year, and then ESSER 3 actually extends it by another year. So there'll be some strategy in terms of how to kind of smooth it across the years. But a very key provision of ESSER 3 was that it gave us that extra year. That was really important. And then one key detail you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide is that ESSER 3, not ESSER 1 or 2, but ESSER 3 includes a requirement that 20% of the funds be spent on the broad category of what's called learning loss programs. Now you can see 20% of $57 million is, it's a significant amount of money. That's over $11 million. So that's a substantial earmark that we wouldn't necessarily have to demonstrate until the 23-24 school year, but that is one way in which ESSER 3 differs from the previous two. Any questions on this before I go to the next slide?
I have a question. I want to know what's defined as learning loss. That kind of is a trigger word for a lot of educators. So I'm curious how it's defined in the ESSER funding.
Pretty liberally, or by liberally, I mean in a way that empowers school districts to develop programs that they think will help mitigate the learning loss that occurred over the period of the pandemic and COVID-19. There are a whole host of different types of costs and programs that are allowed in there, including extending the day, extending the year, enriching the day, enriching the year, buying new instructional materials, implementing new programs. So, and the law itself has a definition of learning loss, but it's several paragraphs long. So it's not, in my view, not restrictive.
Right.
it tends to be open to, you know, letting districts think strategically in that way.
And Ben, thank you for that. I just wanted to add to Director Beno to your question. It does sound and seem counterintuitive when we think of learning loss, because that implies that learning has occurred and then somehow it's no longer there. Another word that really speaks perhaps more aptly to it is acceleration of learning. That somehow this experience has not allowed students to gain as much information, knowledge, and skills and abilities compared to a normal year.
Thank you, Dr. Watts, for that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
I have a question too, going back to the ESSER federal funding, because I called Chris Rakedahl on Thursday and talked a lot about this specific thing, ESSER funding, because I had seen that we didn't get March apportionment, and we're in, I think 14 schools didn't get ESSER apportionment for March. But as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, once the OSB feels our plan meets their requirements, then we'll get that March apportionment. That's one thing I couldn't get a handle on.
Okay. So I'm going to break down a couple things there. So let's talk about first the term apportionment and how the money comes to us. So for either ESSER 1, ESSER 2, or ESSER 3, we won't actually get a standard apportionment on a month-to-month basis. So if you look at our apportionment statement and it doesn't have a line for ESSER, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. So the way that this entire program works is on a reimbursement basis. And the best way that I can explain it is, don't take the metaphor too far, but you know how like a gift card works, or like a coffee card, where somebody gives you a $50 coffee card. You don't have $50 in the bank, but every time you want to go get something, you just swipe it, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of doesn't reflect on your fund balance, but it pays for the things that you buy as you buy them, right? That's kind of how this works. So, for example, in ESSER 1, every 3 months or so, we'll go in and make a claim, and we will get revenue associated with the claim we make at that time. But they don't like send us like monthly payments, if that makes sense.
I understand that piece of it.
Okay.
I guess what I understood, and that was last Thursday, so that was almost a week ago.
Sure.
Was that our plan had not been approved, so we can't put any claims towards ESSER 2 funds yet because the plan at that point hadn't been approved. Us and 13 other school districts.
Okay. And so I'm not going to try to. I mean, you spoke directly with him, and I don't. All I can say is the following: we haven't even actually finished spending our ESSER $1 yet, so we haven't made it. We wouldn't making any claims on 2 until we've exhausted 1, and that's actually the next slide. I can show you kind of where we're at with our claims.
Okay, I guess
go ahead.
My big concern is I see almost $90 million on the table, and one of the pieces of that conversation too, where we're by the governor's mandate, the plan is one thing, but following the plan and the governor's mandate is going to be another thing. So probably a different discussion, but just when I see, that's one thing that he stressed to me on Thursday too, was $90 million, right? So it's probably going to be a discussion, and maybe for the meeting, we need to talk about the plan and making certain that every student that wants to go back gets in the school so we can make claims on those ESSER 2 and ESSER $3. So I just, it's a lot of money that could help kids.
So, Vice President Bettinger, I believe we've had some conversation about this and the dollars on the table. And at the time that you were speaking to Superintendent Reichdahl, we were still also in the process of bargaining. So OSPI set a date for all districts to complete a form and submit a response. And we were not complete with our bargaining process across our labor groups. And that was one of the questions actually, had we completed that in the plan submission, and we had not. So it's not a complete surprise that they did not approve our plan because we hadn't completed all of those things. So we could make no guarantees as to completely what our learning model is. I believe we provided an additional update of where we were with our bargaining. And we, since that time, have presented a schedule to families for our elementary and secondary students. So we are well on our path to have a plan that's approved, meet all of the requirements of the law, even to the extent of all of those pieces, not just having all students in, but exceeding the learning minutes, because that was another requirement that people seem to have skipped, is that it's not just 30% of their instructional time, that districts are also obligated to try to increase that throughout the course of the remaining school days. And so we opted for a plan that exceeded that from the beginning, so that when we bargained with our labor groups, we could bargain authentically and not have to come back to the table in the midst of that to shift things for students. So no, we haven't completed, we don't have a plan that's approved, but we just completed the bargaining process with all of our labor groups. And we're still fine tuning some of the details, but we are well on our way to have our elementary students back in on the 12th and our secondary students back in on the 19th.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so here's where we're at on ESSER 1. So I think we'll probably exhaust ESSER 1 in April. So through March, we had claimed 5.9 of the original 7.3. And you'll see kind of in broad categories how those break out. The largest expenditure was, we had about the equivalent of about 4 days of training, technical assistance, and preparation time for beginning of the school year. Instructional supplies for students, PPE, technology and equipment. So we did charge a lot of that. Remember the discussion about hotspots and laptop repairs and integrating voice with Teams. And so that got us to about 5.9 million. And the remainder that we'll claim this month will be, remember, because we continue to pay our bus drivers and child nutrition workers this year, despite a drop in revenue. We can claim that loss of revenue as part of ESSER 1. So we'll make that claim in April. Okay. So really hot off the presses, received some of the briefing materials from the legislature yesterday about the House and Senate proposals. I created this chart to give you a flavor for some of the high level things that were proposed. Generally speaking, if you see that both the House and the Senate are proposing something, it's going to probably be in the final budget. What's interesting is where the differences lie. So both budgets appropriate the ESSER 3 dollars, which is great. Both budgets propose some form of budget stabilization, but they have different approaches to doing it. So the Senate kind of splits out the approach to stabilizing enrollment and stabilizing pupil transportation, and has different rules for that, whereas the Senate proposes substantially less money for that and basically counts it net of your ESSER funding. So the idea being that, if you're going to get $99 million of ESSER funding, the House is saying you really ought not expect any additional stabilization dollars for enrollment and transportation. That does not appear to be the case with the Senate budget. It looks like districts such as Kent would receive additional stabilization dollars on top of ESSER. Counselors in high poverty schools was an addition in both budgets, but by different amounts. A separate and large allocation for learning loss programs. There's your term again, member Bento. That is, remember, so in ESSER, the vast majority of the money was directly allocated to school districts, right? Or made available for claims to school districts, but some of it was allocated to the agency to create grant programs. And one of the grant programs will be centered on learning loss. One of the most interesting things that emerged out of here is the second to last line, which is the House allocates $278 million to extend the school year by 5 days. which is quite significant. The Senate does not do that. And then finally, doesn't happen very often, but the COLA proposals for the two chambers differ ever so slightly. I'm not really sure if that was a mistake or by intention, but 2%, 1.5% versus 2% and 1.6%. These next two slides are really detailed, and I'm not gonna like read everything, but they're more for your reference to give you a little bit more detail if you want in terms of what the Senate and the House are doing. But I put green checks against a couple of them that are worth highlighting. So let's look at the Senate first. The Senate's putting some money in special education, professional development, which I know has been a priority, and as well as funding with federal funds the community learning center model, which is this idea of keeping school buildings open beyond the typical hours of the school day for a variety of community services. In the House, House makes a very significant investment in educational technology. They propose removing the running start enrollment limit, which could impact us. So remember that, when you're a student and you want to go to high school in Kent, and then you also want to go to, let's say, Green River Community College, you can't exceed, I believe the cap at 1.2% is the total. This proposal would eliminate that cap, which would probably result in more enrollment for school districts and community colleges. But that's a significant proposal. And then one thing that also appears in both proposals is the professional development for paraeducators. So you might remember that from a couple of years ago when the legislature passed the first law on professional development for paraeducators. They've now provided a second wave of funding, which will mean additional days of training for paraeducators, if it happens. Okay. Then we're going to kind of move into the next phase here. I'm going to give you some slides on budget status. So remember, I've been talking to you about how the blue line is really high in the fall, right? Because why? The state funds us based on what we budgeted, not the students that we actually receive, right? And then starting in January, they start to kind of true up for that. There's a correction. So you'll see the blue line there. Kind of compare the blue line in December, January, and February this year as compared to the two prior years. And you see a difference. So that blue line's starting to pull down, right? Which is expected. And that just simply reflects the fact that, Kent, like all school districts, receive much lower enrollment than they budgeted for, okay? And so, we have a high and healthy fund balance, but you're going to start to see that blue line start to close gap with the yellow line. And that's not a problem. It's not a problem at all. It's just a fact. Okay. Here's how enrollment looks through March when we look at it month to month. Okay. The red dotted line is our current year. And you can see it doesn't really follow the same shape. And I was a little discouraged by a little bit of a blip there in February and March where we're dipping below the previously established line. But my hope is that once we return to in-person instruction, we'll get a really good sense of what our enrollment bounce back will be. How many of the kiddos that were either being homeschooled or private school or with a provider will be returning. So that will be very valuable information, I think, that we can monitor in the spring months. Okay. So here is where we are at with regards to aggregate enrollment projections for next year's budget. These bars are showing you, going left to right, budget to actual, budget to actual, budget to actual for the last 3 years, right? And then the bar chart that is like the side hash there at the end is our current projection for next year. So you can see we're being, kind of a colloquial way to say it is we're projecting that some of the kids will come back, but not all of them. So that's a conservative assumption. And my guess is that there's more upside than downside to that projection. My hope is that more kids would return. But we won't know until we know, of course. Okay. The other thing that happens in March is we get schools started on their school-based budgets. And part of that is the base, we do a base allocation rate for maintenance, supplies, and operating costs, the so-called MSOC rate. And so reflecting the fact that we've kind of restored our financial health, remember, many of you will remember, we had to reduce that MSOC rate pretty considerably there in fiscal year 18. And then we kept it there for a couple years, and now we're all the way back to the rates that we were. So you see kind of a U-shaped recovery, if you will. So school districts are seeing an increase in their budget allocations for non-salary costs next year. Okay. So local levy. So it doesn't seem like that long ago when we passed our EP&O levy. But it was a 2-year levy, right? So we are actually now, the school year that we are budgeting for is the last final school year of our approved levy. Okay, so a couple things that I want you to pick out of this. First is the difference between what you see for the 2021 school year, which is the year we're in, and the 21-22 school year is about 8.3 million. So we are going to have, in theory, assuming that tax rate collections remain constant, whatever, we have an increase in our funding source for levy. Okay, but then that's it for the EP&O levy that we approve. So, one of the things that will be coming your way in the summer and the fall is that annual process of recertifying a levy and putting something on the ballot and all of that will start, those activities will occur in the fall, this coming fall, as we look to put something on the ballot sometime during the next calendar year. And typically that is early in the following calendar year. Okay. And so you'll remember that the current levy that we were in had that philosophy of a flat overall tax rate, which within a penny or two we were able to maintain. And the reason you see an increase in the EP&O levy is because we have decreases in other parts of our levy. But now that philosophy kind of ends with this levy, and the district will be faced with a new decision in terms of renewing a new 2, 3, or 4-year levy going forward. Okay. One of the things that we've been taking a real close eye to, particularly during the pandemic, has been the fines and fees that are charged in our school system. One of the decisions that was made earlier this year at Dr. Herman's direction and support, I say, is that this year, given all that students and families have been through, we didn't even charge ASB cards this year. So students were able to just, to the extent that athletics and activities are resuming here in the current school year, students will be able to participate without having to buy an ASB card in the month of April or May, which seemed kind of awkward. You're almost all the way through the year. So the pandemic has had obviously a very significant impact on student activities, the ability to fundraise, and what you can do based on health guidelines. But another significant thing that's happened is that the legislature has changed the rules for what can be charged for ASB programs. And I bring this to the board's attention because it's going to be an issue for the next few years. I think you're going to be hearing more and more about this. The intent of this new law, it's very laudable and very consistent with our goals as a school district, which is that don't want to create barriers for students and family members who are from free and reduced price lunch eligible homes to be able to participate in activities. So that means that as a district now, effective this year, we cannot require students to buy a card or pay admission fees to activities in the ASB environment if they are qualifying students of a free and reduced price lunch family. Hasn't been a huge issue during the pandemic simply because those activities has been suspended. But as we go forward, these ASB budgets rely on the revenue from those cards, and it's going to place pressure on those programs either to do more fundraising or reduce their activities. And it's a quandary that all the school districts are facing right now. But for this year, we have as a district decided to simply subsidize the entire program so that no students are faced with that barrier.
Ben, before you move on, Director Benno has a question on
Oh,
two slides
okay.
prior. And then Director Hamada has a question, I believe, related to the slide you were just on. So before you go.
Yes. My question, I'm looking at the middle school fees, and like you all know, I'm a CTE teacher, so I look for that kind of stuff. I'm just curious why in middle school we're charging for things like cooking, creative cooking, family consumer science, foods. Like CTE funds provide money for students to be able to do things in the program. So why are we charging students to access things that CTE pays for? Like that's a huge concern for me to see that on the budget.
That's a great question. And it's a huge concern for me too. And it's why the slide is on here. So that is part of the process. I was trying to kind of gauge how much time you want to spend on this, but let's spend some time on this. Since I got here in the district, I must be candid that I was surprised at how many fees there were, for starters. And my first step has kind of been to even frankly kind of corral all the fees, get them on one schedule and understand what they were. The second thing that we did was we started, and it's amazing that you would mention CTE because that was exactly the first thing we did, which is that CTE is a well-funded program. Depending on the district you're in, sometimes they're able to spend all of their money. Sometimes they end up reverting money back to the state. It's not uncommon for reversions. But it made no sense to me whatsoever that we're charging a fee to a student or a family for a class in a program that hasn't exhausted all of its budget capacity. So what we did last year, you're seeing an older schedule, but CTE fines or fees are no longer allowed. So you can't charge a fee in a CTE class anymore. And that kind of policy, though it's not actually in district policy, that rule is in effect for as long as we are certainly amply funded in that program, which we are. But it led to more, Director Bendo. So it wasn't just CTE, right? So it was like, well, wait a second here. So why are the fee amounts in one school different than the fee amounts in another school?
That was my next question. Yes.
Or for what is ostensibly the same class, right? And I have a bit of a personal passion about this. Like I just, I mean, as a parent, I want this to make sense, and I want it to be something that is coordinated and reflects the values of the district and the board. And so, to take your comment just one step further, we have talked about kind of just fundamentally overhauling the entire structure of what we are allowed to do for fines and fees, particularly given the additional funding that we have via ESSER, right? So one thought process, okay, to the extent that we're charging families for instructional materials and supplies at all. You know, without getting too far ahead of my skis here. But the idea being, if that's an eligible ESSER expense, it's an idea to pursue that instead of charging families those fees, we incur that cost through our ESSER claims is one, you know. Now that doesn't work for, you can't just kind of say every single, you know, there's nuances to it. There's certain fees, like there's a parking fee, for example, and I could see that there's probably like a legitimate reason to want to have a parking fee other than just the revenue of the parking. But there's certain classes where, you know, we charge for disposable workbooks, and that's legal, certainly legal, but it doesn't mean we have to. And if we do, we should certainly do it equitably. So I'm glad you raised the question. A lot of people spend a little more time on it, but you know, the board gets to see this schedule as part of budget adoption. And I would certainly welcome a conversation about, you know, how we can utilize the resources of ESSER to make some steps forward in how we do this process.
And I just want to say that Director Benno, I believe it was the fall of this school year, the board had a conversation because there's policy related to fines and fees. And we started talking about this, the board started talking about this as a collective of where they might want to go. And I said that Ben was going to share additional information about some of the details of this. And he's been working with our secondary principals and administrators about shifting and some of the thought in this. So
I appreciate that. I just as an educator, as a community member, as a board member, I just have a problem with our taxpayers pay for schools, but yet we are using our students like money factory, like, oh, we're going to collect $10 here, $5 here. And I just don't feel comfortable with that. And I don't think, not that we don't charge students fees for anything, but I feel like that as a school that's providing services, that we shouldn't nickel and dime students like this, but that's just a personal belief that I may bring. That's my lens I'm going to bring into this. But I really appreciate this slide, and I really appreciate your feedback on this. That was very, very helpful.
And based on our conversation today, I think one of the things I can do is, you know, bring some hard proposals, you know, like talk about like, well, what, instead of talking about it in concept, like, you know, option A, option B, option C, what could we do? Because it's been a very decentralized process over a very long period of time. And now it's kind of, but ultimately at the end of the day, you know, individual schools or individual employees in schools don't have the legal authority to get to decide about fees. That is something that a school district does. So good discussion. Okay.
Then Director Hamada.
Oh,
Previous slide, Director Hamada.
Thank you very much. Quick question, Mr. Rarick. You said that a percentage of the ASB cost goes to programs. Is there an overall percentage figure that you can give me for all of that?
Let me make sure I understand. A percentage of the ASB, can you say it again? Sorry.
The fees that you collect for ASB, you said a percentage of that goes to programs.
Oh, what I was saying was that the revenue from the ASB cards, the whole purpose really of having ASB cards and charging for them is that it generates revenue for those ASB budgets, which are run by the students and approved by the students. And so it's not a percentage so much, it's the entire amount. You know.
Oh, okay.
Right.
You used the word percentage, so that.
Oh, sorry. But what I meant by percentage was that, so if you look at an ASB budget, a percentage of it will be funded by the ASB cards, but then there'll be other part that is funded by, you know, fundraising that the kids do. That can be a variety of different.
Okay, I get it.
Right. You've probably all been involved in some sort of, you know,
yes.
ASB fundraiser, whether you've had your car washed or you know, whatever it may be.
Right.
So the point I was trying to illustrate here is that while most of us would certainly see the goal of this new law as laudable and consistent with all of our values as an organization. That the lost revenue associated with this has not been replaced by the legislature. So each district is kind of left to kind of figure out how it's going to maintain a robust ASB programs for all students in the absence of ASB fees for those families.
Are the people that are running those programs and the kids themselves that are in those programs, are they aware of this change that could be coming up, or is this just going to hit them in the face and when school starts up again?
Yeah, we started rolling it out in the fall of last year and or the fall of this year, and it was a shock. I mean, there was a fair amount of disbelief, like that can't be what the law says, but it is. It's been a significant project and impact for all districts. It's just that you haven't really heard as much about it because of COVID, right? It really took effect right around the time that all those activities were essentially being suspended. So, and it provided me the opportunity to say that, for this year, the district just subsidized this with the general fund. We basically said, you don't have to buy ASB cards this year, which seemed like the right thing to do given the timing of when we, all that, everything that these families have been through. But that's probably not a long-term solution, and so that'll be an ongoing conversation.
No, I totally understand. And I'm glad that, again, with all they've had to deal with it, we found a way to make that work. I apologize. I had a repairman that I had to deal with, a refrigerator, but I had another quick question, and I'm sorry if it's out of order, but with the projected number of kids maybe going down, is it too early, or can you say anything about any staffing changes that we're going to have to reduce, or is that in the works, or can we speak to that today at all, please?
A little bit. Obviously I'll defer to
I can do it if you
the
want.
Human Resources Department when they're going to roll out their actual staffing, but
If you want, then I can. Oh,
go ahead.
so Director Hamada, we've started the initial staffing process, and the decision we made as a district, because projections are based on history, but our recent history is very different, as you can see in the slide, than what we would expect. We have adopted a model that's more consistent with our 1920 staffing. So that's because we're anticipating a slight rebound, but we're unsure of the exact amount of rebound. And so 1920 for us will position us to do a couple of, it will do some things that will allow us to keep class sizes where they were in 1920 as a start. And then we'll see if, as students return, of course, we may have to hire additional staff. But we're not planning reductions across our schools right now in terms of our basic ed staffing, because we don't want to cut positions and then have students return and then be in a mad dash to hire qualified and competent staff to do that work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
The other thing to keep in mind, which will be important to remember as we go through all of the budget work sessions, is even at our reduced enrollment number, we're doing fine. So we were, during this year, we were, and still are, as you saw from the fund balance slide, not really having those strong deficits like some of our neighboring districts were. So, sometimes when enrollment goes down, you don't necessarily reflexively have to reduce staff if you're able to maintain at the current enrollment level. So we're in very good shape, and so it gives us, we've kind of earned a little bit of margin of error, if you will.
But Mr. Rarick, correct me if I'm wrong, your expenses have gone down too to allow that, right?
Correct. Correct.
That could possibly not happen going forward, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. So it becomes a exercise of, okay, which is why the legislative budgets that just came out are key. You know, what do I think my revenues are going to bounce back to next year? How do I think my expenses are going to rebound, right? So what has happened this year is that, you know, we still have all of our staff, right? So our payroll and our health benefits, all that has been pretty predictable, but it's just been our, you know, our non-salary related costs that have just been, you know, substantially under leveraged. But we have a history. We can see, like, historically, what have we been spending in a typical school year, and so I'm just here to tell you that, you know, there was really no evidence on the table for a need to, like, start cutting staff at the current level. So.
Thank you.
I did have one question. Sorry.
Sure.
I wanted to go back. I'm interested in, because I know I'm familiar with the ASB conversation, and what I'd be interested in hearing is, because again, this applies to, the law applies to students who qualify for free and reduced lunch.
Yeah.
So we still have full paying families. And so what I'd be interested in is how much of a difference it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have, you know, in the past, I've done a lot of family support work, and I've seen families who are not able to attend there to watch their students, you know, participate because they can't afford it. And so I'm all for having no fees for them to attend and watch their students play. And I just would be interested in seeing if there's a potential in the future, if you could provide kind of what that offset would be, like how much exactly would they lose if we stopped charging fees for those students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. I'd be interested in hearing what that difference is, because I think that's something we should really try to maintain, in my opinion, because that's a passion of mine.
If we essentially continued what we're doing this year, basically.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So just what that cost, what that offset would be. Thank you.
And Ben, before you move on, I don't believe Director Vengadaslam has had a chance. She's had her hand up, and I didn't hear her voice. So.
Okay, thank you. No, I thank you, President Daniels. I was about to go there too. But as an extension, I'd like to know, I know that Mr. Warrick and Dr. Harmon, you both mentioned that it's going to have a long-term effect. And so the legislative proposals are coming up for our districts. And I'm wondering if this is something that we need to talk about fully funding in the coming years. I know we can use some of these funds. I don't know if SR2, we can use funds from there or not. But one of the arguments that legislators always make when you ask for fully funding is, well, you have a lot of flexibility with ESSER funding. And so I think it'd be good to kind of have an idea of what we can exactly pay out of ESSER funds versus what is unfunded. So I'd appreciate that information as well. Sure. But for legislative reasons. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So the other thing that we have historically done in our first work session, when we're kind of just getting started with thinking about the process, is to think about what are the issues that we're planning for. So here's a list of 6 issues that I think characterize our kind of intermediate and longer term planning from a budget standpoint. Number 1 on the list is ESSER investments. There's no other way to say it. It's a substantial sum of money. It certainly exceeded my original expectations, and I know that was true for our neighboring districts as well. The challenge is, 80 to 85% of our costs are staffing. And you typically don't want to get too aggressive with staffing when it's a one-time revenue. Nevertheless, it's a significant opportunity to make an impact for kids, no question about it. So there will be important conversations about summer programming, learning loss programming, investments in health and safety, that are not a 1-year conversation, but rather a 3.5-year conversation. If you think about fiscal year 2024 and how to kind of stagger this money over the period of time for which it is eligible to be claimed. So that's an important conversation. The second significant long-term consideration is enrollment. As the previous slide illustrated, we've had some, after many years of extremely steady enrollment in CAT, like almost a decade of really rock solid enrollment. We've had some volatility in the recent years, and then obviously COVID has had volatility for all districts. We fell just about average in terms of how districts were impacted by lost enrollment in COVID-19. But we were really at a considerable disadvantage in projecting enrollment for next year because, you know, you don't have any real empirical history to draw from when you're talking about what we've been through, which is a once in a lifetime situation. So when we get back into classes, even when it's just in a hybrid or partial time, to really keep very close track of how many kids are coming back in the spring, and what that might tell us about the fall, is going to be crucial and interesting information as we plan for, you know, staffing and programming, not just next year, but in the years that follow. Number 3, the EP&O levy. Here we are. So it's been, what, a year and a half? Yes, not quite, since we passed the last EP&O, and we'll have something else on the ballot in the winter or spring of next calendar year. I mean, we will have to, because we will be done with our levy. So there are decisions and planning to be done in the fall, gearing up for that. And one of the decisions will be the length of the levy, regardless of the size of the levy. Discussing the length of the levy, we opted for a 2-year last time, right? There might be reasons to do that again, and there might be reasons to extend it. Number 4, the reboundary discussion that we had this year remains vital to the district, both from the standpoint of the long-term placement of 6th graders and the impact that has on the configuration of our buildings, staffing, and funding, as well as just balancing enrollment district-wide. So we are working feverishly as a district to prepare for the opening of the 2 new buildings. And that is really manifesting, you know, this September with work happening right now. But I am trying to kind of think ahead a little bit in terms of, you know, we may not be done with that discussion, and what does the next year budget need to look like to accommodate more significant shifting in the arrangement of our schools and our boundaries. And then finally, the SEP program is going to be a major initiative for the district next year. I believe, and I can't hold me to this, but I think it is 10 schools. That number I think has changed a couple of times, but that's why I put estimated there. I don't know that we've submitted the final application, but it could be almost the doubling of the number of schools that participated. And so that has implications for kids and families, as well as several ways in which we fund our schools and the use of free and reduced price lunch data. And so one way that it impacts schools is there's so many ways that free and reduced price lunch is a proxy used in our funding formulas, either the state to the local, or in terms of the way that the local school district uses it to allocate schools. And so we're already finding that it's going to be a significant change, but of course, in the end, we hope one that benefits kids and families. Okay, so wanted to give you a high-level overview.
Yes. Real quick, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, that's why I was looking to.
Okay.
No, it's fine. Talking about the dip in enrollment, January to February to March.
Yep.
If we had any ideas of what might have led to that, or
I don't. I don't. You mean the small dip from
Yeah,
January to February? Yeah. It's a pretty small dip. Now you'll see if you look at the prior years on the slide, it's not uncommon to go down a little bit from January to February and from February to March. You see that? So if you look like at the green line, the blue line, orange line. But this year's curve was kind of looking differently, and I thought that we would hold the line from November to December to January, because obviously prior year curves really don't fit. So I don't, it's not, I hope it doesn't make it look too big. That's not a ton of kids, but still, I was hoping that that line would go up, not down. Now, I would expect to see that red dotted line tick up now that we are offering in-person opportunities. If it doesn't, that would give me pause. So when I look at this line in May, I want to see it in a geometric rise up, because that'll tell me, like, okay, is the opportunity to engage in person influencing the decisions of families to send their kids back. So I give you these monthly, you get the financial updates in April and May. This is going to be an interesting line to watch.
So I guess I'm kind of wondering about that. If the kids are not going to come back to school in April, what would make them come back to school in May for a month?
I don't know.
So would that be I'm just wondering if that is going to be the right measure. Can we do some other type of inquiry about back to school at that point or earlier?
Yeah. So the key point here that I'm agreeing with what you're saying. Key thing to remember that Dr. Harmon said earlier is that we made a strategic decision to not reduce staffing all the way down to where that red line is, because first of all, we kind of earned the right, we built up our fund balance, and we got a little bit of flexibility, right? But the second thing is, you don't want to be caught having to hire a bunch of staff in the fall if they all show up again, right? So when I say I want to see that line going up, it's because I'm trying to project our revenues, but from a staffing standpoint, we're just preparing for the kids essentially to return. There's going to be individual exceptions in school, but generally speaking, it's not a cutting of staff. If anything, it's actually an enrichment. So I hope that puts some helpful context to it. Does that sound right, Jewel? Did I articulate that correctly?
No, I think that's fair. The other question was about House Bill 1342. Well, yeah, House Bill 1342, waiving the elementary lunch copays.
Oh yeah. That is on here somewhere. Didn't go into it in depth. Let me see if I can find it.
So just the question was, I know CEP is there, and then we're also paying. Is that, I guess all of these questions, it would be helpful to see in the budget what exactly ESSER can pay for, because I want to avoid that whole flexibility argument. And if we're going to legislature, and if we're saying to the public that this is a big issue for us long term, we have till 2024 potentially for funding. And so can that be carried, up until then, some of these expenses without affecting staffing? So I guess long term, when you talk about budgeting, that would be helpful to know.
Okay. I will try to do that. and I will try to do that, but just a caveat that the allowable uses under these ESSER funds are quite expansive, and in some cases intentionally, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Intentionally expansive, leaving some room for interpretation. And so, you know, I think the case to the legislature and the case to our voters is this money isn't here forever. I mean, we're going to basically, the intent of the money was to help school districts recover from the pandemic. That is the explicit intent of the bill. And that's not a long-term solve for any of our, kids don't go to school for just 2 years, right? I mean, we're trying to kind of build a long-term, sustainable, rigorous program. And so part of this will be, to the extent that we make ESSER investments in some of these areas, can we rely on the legislature or the voters to help us sustain those investments that we've made, or do they vanish? Which seems unfair. Like if, certain kids were in high school during that time and they got the robust, and then, it's a kind of a longer term equity consideration for generations of our students. So it has been an incredible year for everybody. I know for you, and certainly for the team. And you've seen so many timelines. So here's another one. This is the budget timeline for this year, adjusted a little bit to reflect the realities that we're dealing with right now. It's not that different from what you've dealt with before. The key dates are the end of August and the end of June. Remember, we basically send OSPI a technical rough draft of our budget at the end of June, and we usually do our third work session just before that gets sent. So you'll remember that. It's typically just right around the time we're adjourning for the summer with the schools. There's a work session where you're kind of getting your first glimpse of the budget fully pulled together. That rough draft, I call it a rough draft because we have the right legally to change it if we need to, but typically the changes aren't huge. That gets sent to OSPI, and then we have a hearing at the end of August in which we adopt the budget. So you can expect another work session in mid-April. I believe it's the 14th. Tonight was intended to be a real good background in the factors that we're dealing with. Our hope is that, it's a pretty quick turnaround here, but our hope is that the next presentation, we're going to be able to digest some of this legislative activity and try to get a better sense of what our revenue picture, and actual real numbers could look like. And we may also have some staffing information for you at that time. I am not certain of that, but so we'll put a little bit more meat to the bone in April. And then the third section, work session, will be the last work session prior to the submission of the draft to OSPI. So thank you for listening to me. If you have any additional questions or comments, I'm available for you.
I have some questions, but I see that Chief West put something in the notes. I want to read it. Maybe Chief West, you could speak to that.
Hi, good evening, members of the board. Yeah, I didn't want to kind of interrupt Ben's flow. So in the previous slide with the fees and fines section, and it shared middle school programs that are assessing fines to students. And Meeker Middle School is one of our only middle schools that was listed there, and that course is the only CTE funded course. And this is just a little bit of a nuance. There was a new teacher that started after the beginning of the school year, and that was corrected in terms of their process, and no fee should have been assessed to students. CTE provided guidance at the beginning of this school year, like indicating for any of our secondary programs, students should not be assessed any fines or fees for participating in CTE programs. So the middle school courses that you saw listed aren't CTE funded courses. I just thought that, you know, that might be an important point to clarify to Director Benno's point earlier.
Which is great, but ultimately my main question then would be those would all be CTE funded if they did the frameworks and all the processes, so it could get funded because those are all would be CTE family consumer science courses if all the paperwork and stuff would be done. So I'm pretty knowledgeable of that. So
well, we've had actually we've kind of worked through this process with OSPI, and we've received some different guidance around
interesting
what frameworks could actually be approved for middle school.
And that could be something out of like middle school. I know has some different requirements where there has to be financial stuff and then tech and engineering and things like that. So that could be something that I don't see the framework, so I don't know. So I just made an assumption based on the titles of the classes.
Yeah. But broader point is we don't charge fees in our CTE classes. Just we used to, we don't anymore.
So I have some further questions because last year when we did this, we also sat down as a board and we talked about our priorities regarding funding. And I did hear Vice President Daniels talk about fees, you know, for families to attend events and things like that. So are we going to have a meeting where the board does have a chance to just sit down and talk about priorities and putting money to the mission? Because that's part of our role too, is to set the parameters and to set the vision. And last year we did have a session where we did discuss those type of things. And especially with a levy coming up, you know, that again, that's kind of money to the mission kind of thing. So is that going to be on the 14th?
So Vice President Bettinger, thank you for that question. I think it's certainly fitting that you ask, and that all board directors, as we recall, we did have a values, beliefs, priorities, and commitment section scheduled on our previous board superintendent governance team meeting. While we chose a different pathway, know that priority still exists. And I think it's a great opportunity. I do not disagree. Opportunity for each one of our school board directors to provide that information, starting with belief statements that lead to values, that lead to commitments, that lead to priorities. So I welcome that opportunity and look forward to that in the very near future. I can't say if that's going to be specifically on the 14th, but I think sooner the better.
Okay, and for that, if it's, you know, again, if it's through a framework like the leadership challenge, I'd prefer a facilitator on that.
No, I understood your input, and if we can arrange that, if not, I certainly know that information can be shared equally and successfully as a board superintendent governance team. We will certainly work through that.
Yeah, because like I said, what President Daniel said, I mean, that really struck me because that's one of the things, you know, we had a lot of discussion about is kids being involved in school. And it even kind of came up with the Core 24 and making sure that our students are involved in schools and how we do that. And then hearing Director Benno talk about the CTE courses and things like that. So yes. I think there's enough interest in just the day-to-day, what's going on in our schools and where we want to put money to the mission. So, you know,
thank you.
It's important that we have that conversation. I have a couple other questions. It's way back on the first slide. You don't have to go back there, but $277,000 for PPE. Is that enough? Do we that just seems like such a low amount for PPE based on what I have seen just in the news of what some other districts are paying for that.
Yeah, remember, this is not how much we've spent on PPE. This is how much we happen to claim for ESSER 1.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. I'm sorry, I got confused on that.
We'll be well over that.
Yeah,
over that
I was
number.
like, that doesn't seem.
Yeah.
And then to go back to December, because I don't think I ever got an answer on that. The F-196. We had that there was a variance of 49. About a $40,000 variance in total expenditures. So we spent 40,000 less than we had budgeted for. Is that where this extra money is coming from, or where your confidence is in our budget?
Okay, you're gonna
I
ask you
believe
to help
you-
me out with that one.
I believe you mean 40 million. Maybe?
Yeah, 40 million. I'm sorry, 40
Okay.
million.
Yeah.
It's been a long day. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harmon. You had my back on that one. Yeah, 40 million. It's on the F-196. And I just again, I wanted to understand where, that's where we didn't spend that money. Again, talking about money to mission. So we didn't spend it. So is that, I would prefer a report on or an deeper understanding of why we didn't spend that money. But barring that, is that why we're confident right now?
So here's why I'm confident. I'm trying to be responsive to your question, truly. I'm just trying to pick out which part to start with. So I keep track monthly of how much money we're spending by object, by activity, relative to the revenues we're bringing in. And I expected that we would have a large reduction in revenue this year, which we did. What I did not expect, I expected partly, but probably not to the extent that it happened, is how significantly programs have been unable essentially to spend most of their budgets because we're not in school buildings, right? So I think you mentioned it earlier, or I think Director Hamada mentioned it earlier. Revenues way down, but also expenses way down, right? Significantly down. So in an environment like that, I have to go, okay, I have to imagine what next year might look like and imagine that we would have lower enrollment and make a prognostication about, is it necessary in those scenarios to make cuts? Okay. The conclusion I come to is that it's not necessary to make cuts for a couple of reasons. The first is that, I'm going to take you back to this slide. Okay. So we've had a tremendous turnaround, obviously. And part of why you have a fund balance is so that, you earn yourself a little flexibility to plan for the unknown. And so if this were 3 years ago and we were dancing on a head of a pin with, are we going to end the year positive or aren't we? We would not enjoy that same level of flexibility. But when we're starting the year with a fund balance in excess of $64 million, we are holding our own this year in terms of our expenses to revenues. They're just, you're speaking to somebody who's kind of by nature a little conservative with this. I'm struggling to find an argument for why we would be considered to be struggling. Now, layer on top of that the federal government is expected to appropriate to us $99 million over the course of the next 4 fiscal years. Now, we can't use that necessarily. We can't. We want to be very cautious about using that for staff and be very careful and strategic about the deployment of those dollars. But when you combine those two factors, my headspace is not how many cuts I have to make. My headspace is how do I responsibly gear the organization to make use of all of those resources in a responsible and strategic manner. And I had a very important conversation earlier today with key strategic leaders in the district about this very conversation. $99 million is probably more economic influx to the Kent School District than they've ever received before. I certainly can't think of a precedent for that, assuming it comes to pass and that it's appropriated and all that.
I guess to be clear, I don't think we're in a bad financial position. I just think, I guess at the end of the year ending August 31st, 2020, there were $40 million we didn't spend.
Yes.
And so to me, that feels like money on the table that could have put, again, money to the mission. And we struggled this time last year, we were struggling. And I don't think our students, were in schools again until after spring break. So I'm just trying to understand money left on the table.
Okay, so I can help a little bit with that. The first thing is that as a general proposition, I don't really think it matters which school district you're in. I don't think. Expenditures are always going to come in lower than budget. They're structured that way because your budget is your budget is not an average. It's your max authority, right? So you're always, if you want to pull some peer districts or whatever and compare budget to expenses, I'm going to guess that you're going to see material disparities between those two numbers, and you should. Now, having said that, yes, last year there were certainly programs that were under expended, and I understand why. So I think that we went to completely virtual in early March, was it? Which in our fiscal year cycle is about halfway through. You don't think of it that way because you think of the school year, but the fiscal year, I can do some quick finger math here, but it's roughly halfway through the fiscal year. So for half the fiscal year, we were not operating in our traditional environment, the environment that all these programs budgeted for, right? So the previous spring, they're budgeting for an environment, and then world pandemic hits. So I wasn't necessarily alarmed that some of these programs were unable to spend all their money, and it was not a experience unique to Kent. That's, I hope I made a good faith effort to respond to your question.
Yeah, I thank you. I just, last year at this time, our kids didn't have remote learning. They had things they could do, but it wasn't instructor led until after as I recall, until after the spring break again. So, when I look at underspend on compensatory programs and things like that, and, thinking about supporting our students with IEPs and special education, et cetera, it's just, I think we underspent like $2 million. So when I see that, again, when we talk about money and where we want money to go, which is a board responsibility, it's important for me to understand how things happened.
Yeah.
So I think
I'm making a good faith effort to respond to you. I hope I've.
Yeah, thank you.
Director Hamada has had a hand up for a while, and so I just want to acknowledge her before we move on.
You're on mute.
You're muted, Director Hamada.
Sorry, I unmuted, it didn't go. I have a quick question. Because I'm a visionary person, because I've worked on levies, because I lost a proposition in Covington by 30 votes as the chairman, I am curious, and I know the economic status of our area and what our people have been through. When is the very latest that we could still maintain, if we went after a levy and probably got it, that we could put it on the ballot?
Okay.
November.
In other words, I'm trying to give people enough time to get the pandemic, to get their bills caught up, to start thinking more positive before you put that out for taxpayers again to say, "Ooh, here we go again," you know, with more money going out.
Sure. So that's
could we go into this
question.
go into
So
the spring of
yeah.
2022?
I'm sorry?
Could we go into the spring, like April of 2022?
You know what? I think, Melissa, is this all fresh in your mind from last time?
So there's a couple things, Director Daniels, President Daniels, members of the board, Dr. Watts-Misali, Director Hamada, there's a couple things that we need to consider always whenever we place something on the ballot. We can only place it twice within the calendar year. And then we also need to consider our budget season. So we need to submit our budget by June. And so if we don't know if the levy's going to pass, and we have February and April, then if we could place it in November, but then we have this gap in our budget. And so there are multiple things competing. And so that's something that we'll work through as a leadership team. We'll work through with the board when we begin those very specific conversations. And then that calendar conversation. And so the levy authorization will come to the board at the beginning of next school year when we have that proposal ready. So that's something that we'll consider, but we'll bring proposals forth before the board. But those are the types of conversations that we'll have and we'll need to consider. But I can go twice in the calendar year.
You're not talking November of 21, are you?
No.
That's okay. Thank you. That's
Yeah, you're welcome.
Big difference. Thank you.
So I think that's all I had. In conclusion, we're in very stable financial health right now. So.
So I think just as an extension of Director Bettinger's conversation about values, one thing that when we talk about flexibility and funding, I would really like to see in April a good discussion on the mental health supports and where we're headed with that. I think we have, we've approached our legislature on that, and we apparently, they continue to say that about the flexibility, but I don't know what that means. I don't know, or the learning loss, or we're calling it accelerated learning, if that encompasses the mental health supports, if we're kind of grouping that with social emotional learning. So I guess I would need some sort of detailed explanation of how we can really strengthen this budget, strengthen the supports through the upcoming budget.
I've made a note of that, and I'm already thinking Dr. Herman may have some things in mind for that.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Eric. Thank you, board directors. So at this time, we're going to transition away from our budget conversation and transition into our policy work. And so we have a small shift in policy for our school operations and academic support team. And so I would like to call up Mr. Randy Heath or Ms. Lindy Barron, and I can pull up the policy 3416 and talk about that as well. I can give you a little bit of preamble while they're getting set up too. Randy, is it okay if I pull it up, or would you?
Yes, yeah, please do.
Okay. So
Pull
I'll
that.
just, I'm going to pull up the version with track changes so they can see the policy piece, and then you just let me know if you want me to share something else or move away from that.
Absolutely. And since I have you here tonight, I want to take this opportunity to really call out Lindy Barron, who is our Assistant Director of Health Services, who has been working incredibly long hours through this whole thing regarding, I don't know what I would do without her. So I want to publicly thank her for all of her work. And in the midst of that, we continue to do just the ordinary work, which we do is around policy and procedure and other things. And so actually in her responding to a parent who, had some concerns around a medication that was going to need to be done at school, what we discovered was that our policy was just slightly out of date in terms of really one thing. But it was a big thing to this parent who, was not going to be able to get the medication to their child that they needed. And so the policy change that you see here, there's some little bit of cleanup just to make sure that we are cross-referenced where we need to go. But really, it's this part right here under inhalers, injections, and suppositories that just is the part that we need to cross out nasal spray. Nasal spray is now something that can be delegated. And so that needed to be stricken, and it is inhalers there that needed to be put into its place. So
actually, Randy, nasal sprays all the way through inhalers. So it should just say suppositories and non-emergency injections.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No,
there was
we're
a
good.
lot of going back and forth here on this thing. So actually, when this comes for second reading, the inhalers will be stricken as well.
Do we have a WASDA policy on this? I didn't see.
Yes, I believe this is in line with WASDA policy.
Okay.
And then honestly, it should have been taken out back in 2018 when we last made this revision, and it somehow was missed. So this is.
I do have a question. So when I think about students with asthma, so their inhalers need to be given to the nurses. And so if they are having an asthma attack, then they would have to actually wait for the nurse, someone to get it from the nurse, or can they hold it on their person?
Right. Lindy, would you like to?
Absolutely. Asthma inhalers can be carried by the student.
Right.
So
Okay.
it is not required to be in. What this is saying here in this particular portion of the policy is that we cannot, only nurses could give this, and that is not correct. Nasal sprays, inhalers can be delegated to office staff. And then in the case of some of these emergency medications like EpiPens or inhalers, students can also carry them on them, obviously depending on their developmental age.
So in the second paragraph, then when it talks about the administration of with the nasal spray in particular, it doesn't say, unless I'm reading it wrong, that a student can do that.
A nasal spray is what they're talking about here, the scheduled drugs of the nasal spray. So
Okay.
they're really talking about the student would be having a seizure. So no, they would not be able to administer it themselves. Someone would have to do it for them.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Can you scroll up? So do we have policy 3419, self-administration of asthma and anaphylaxis medications? Did we already update that one?
Lindy, you know that for sure. If not, we can look.
I can look. I'm not 100% sure when it was last updated. We do have that policy.
Okay. So
Looks like it was adopted on, well, I don't know if it's the last
2015.
updated 2015, February of 2015.
Yeah.
3419.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
Yeah, we probably should look at that one. All of these cross references might need to be updated as well.
Yeah, I was saying we should have WASDA policy next to it as well, you know, with the cross reference. Not to say, Ms. Barron, your work, we appreciate you looking at this and pointing it to the board. We do need to update this for certain.
Yeah.
Yes, and I know that OSPI is going through all of their updates currently right now that they have new representation in the health services area. So they're going through all of these things also. We just noticed that nasal spray never did get taken off, and it should have been taken off because it is a delegatable item now.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you. So before it comes back to second reading, we'll have all that information. Dr. Herman.
You're muted, Dr. Harmon.
So that was embarrassing. I couldn't find my picture to unmute myself. So yes, I will have that. And I just want to say, so I was also checking on 3419 and WASDA model, and I apologize. I do usually send the model policy for reference when I send these to you all. The model for 3419, although we can bring it forward, the last time it was updated for WASDA was 2012. So this is an instance where ours might be a little more current than WASDA's, but it's still worth a review. And then, but absolutely, so I can make sure that that's there for second reading so you can take a look. And Lindy, I'll be happy to help you in any way with that. So
no problem. And it looks like 3420 was last revised in January of 2015.
For us, yeah.
I will say OSPI's medication policy, their last update is 2015.
Oh.
And I think, Lindy, you said that they are working on looking at all their medicine policies. And the only reason this one is coming out of cycle is we caught this error that should have been taken care of in 2018 and for whatever reason did not get taken care of. And so in order to, really serve our students best as they're coming back to school, we felt like we needed to try to get this settled as quickly as possible, which is why we.
And it actually has it correct in one paragraph, but then that one nasal spray paragraph, it doesn't. So we're actually even contradictory in our policy because in one place it says yes and in one place it says no.
Oh, so something, I think I'm missing something here. I did not see this 3416 attached earlier, but there is a file now, and that's the WASDA model policy, but not the one that you're showing on the screen. So if we could have, our KSD policy there too. Okay, now everything's there. So I don't know if it's just getting uploaded, but I did not see that earlier, but okay. Thank you. I'll take a look.
I have a couple random questions, if I may, kind of related, but not. If it's not a time, I can always ask them at a different time.
Okay.
First, I want to talk about if a school nurse is on premises, that's under the 3619 or 3416 we're looking at now. I'm just curious, how many schools have full-time nurses, or how's the nurse distribution here?
In general, there are nurses in each building at least 2 days a week. High schools, we try to have them 3 days a week, if not more. We look at, various programs, number of kids, health room visits, how busy it is. But so some schools have 3. The only schools that have full-time nursing coverages are ones that would require a nurse to be on the premises for things that we cannot delegate. For instance, poking a child's finger to check their blood sugar, injecting insulin, rectal diastat would be another seizure medication, and those cannot be delegated. So there are times when in those instances we do have full nurse coverage in a building.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
And as a general question, I don't know if this is for Dr. Harmon or I can go through President Daniels, is I noticed a lot of the he/she language. I know a lot of model policies going to more gender neutral, like they or them instead of he or she. Is that happening, or are we not dealing with that at this time?
Sorry, finding my picture again. So typically we follow WASDA model, and so as they update that language, but that's something we can definitely start to look at as we move through our policies on our own, because we also have a little bit of, I won't say poetic license, but we do have some flexibility in some of that language. So that's something that we can consider as we move forward. If that's of interest to the board, to use more gender neutral language.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So thank you, Mr. Heath. Thank you, Ms. Barron. I will be in contact tomorrow about our next steps so we can prepare for the 14th. And then I will board leverage the update to provide you with additional information and supports around this, so you all are also prepared and informed for the 14th. And in the essence of time, I am going to stop sharing and reshare rather quickly WASDA's model policy for their resolution for reopening schools. And we can talk about that rather quickly, because I would really rather spend our last minutes on a true direct procedural update. And so hopefully you can see this. So as you know, House Bill 1112 has moved rather quickly through the House and the Senate at the state to address emergency waiver of high school graduation credits, because as we moved into this second school year of COVID reality, they realized that it would have longer lasting impacts on our high school students, well, I'd say secondary students across the board. And so as a result, the bill passed House and Senate and was signed by the governor. And so Washington State Board of Education began working on emergency rules so that school districts could be able to apply this waiver to their students. What makes this different than in the past, there was a waiver last year, but it was temporary and it was specific to COVID. Moving forward, the law is expansive enough that it is for any emergency situation, including pandemic. So the emergency waiver option, although districts will always have to apply to the Washington State Board of Education to use the waiver, that it can be applied anytime there is an emergency of significant magnitude that would impact education of students and credit attainment. And so what you have is WASDA's model resolution for this, and I'm bringing it to you as just more of an awareness, because on the 14th at the regular board meeting, we will bring to you the KSD version of this, meaning that we'll have our school district name filled in, we'll have our appropriate board resolution number, so that we can move forward with reaching out to OSPI and actually completing the application for the waiver so that we can offer this to our students. What makes this, again, addition to being expansive enough to cover all emergencies, it also provides new requirements for school districts in terms of what is reported. They are watching heavily about disproportionality and accessibility for to the waiver process for all students. It also requires that districts engage in a series of good faith efforts prior to leveraging this for a student, or allowing or presenting a student and their family with this as an option, meaning that for students who were not able to obtain the credits, they had to have been on track for on-time graduation prior to this. They had to have made an attempt or be presented the opportunities to recover the credits, either through credit recovery. The law was very specific, through summer school or even a 5th year in high school as an option. It doesn't say they have to complete those things, but they have to be offered and informed of those things prior to doing this. And then they are allowed. We also have to present to families the possible consequences of this at their post-secondary experience. So for example, we may waive a high school math credit, but that does not mean that in their post-secondary institution that would not put them in remedial math courses because they have not met their requirements to be able to take freshman math, for example. It also limits districts into being able to only waive 1 credit per subject area, and students can graduate with no less than 20 credits. Again, I will provide you with additional information about those details in the update, but I wanted you to see that so that you would have time to be prepared and informed for the for the regular meeting on the 14th. And typically we would have spent a little more time on this. If you have questions, I'm happy to take a few, but I want us to spend some time on the last topic. And so last but not least, I will share my screen. And what I provided to you all was what was formerly 4312P and is now 4220P to align with WASDA model policy. We had a KSD numbering of 4312. The WASDA model policy number for complaints against employees or staff is 4220. And so we have updated that in policy, and we're working through procedure. And what you see is a reflection of a couple of things. So WASDA model, process from other districts as well as input from board directors who also reviewed this. Typically, board directors are informed of procedure, and then they're usually placed on, and boards don't take action on procedure. But in this instance, wanted to provide the board some space to discuss this because it has to be discussed in public. I will just caution you that this is loosely related to ongoing litigation, so I'd caution you not to use names or reference that particular situation, and just talk about this from the perspective of general policy and procedure update for the district.
Yeah, I'd like to begin. I really appreciate Dr. Harmon. I think Director Bettinger and I worked on this, including the policy. Including the procedure, and I feel like you incorporated everything into that, but at the same time I feel like you've done a much better job of laying it out in and pointing to that distinction between staff and programs. So I just wanted to say I really appreciated the way it was laid out. It's clear to me. I didn't see any issue. I think you covered all the suggestions we made together. So thank you for your work on that.
Yeah, I would agree. The icing on the cake would be some form of timeline, however many days potentially. That would be, but yeah, I really appreciate this is much closer to what Director Vengadaslam and I worked on, and the other districts that I know I researched and then shared with her on it. And then the form also, which is that I saw, the separate form, I think is helpful too.
Yeah, I'm glad we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure why this was delayed, but it looks good to me.
And so I apologize. And like I said, it's atypical that we have a more robust conversation around procedure, but I wanted to do that because the intention now isn't to bring it forward as informational on the regular meeting on the 14th.
Mm-hmm.
Along with the form, And I can investigate what the timeline, what adding timeline might look like. That may take a deeper conversation with staff. What I would suggest and recommend is that we move forward with the procedural update as it is, and then if we come back with a timeline, we can have another discussion with the board about adding the timeline to the procedure, because then that way that information will be posted for families and for the public if they need it.
Yeah, I think the only, is there somewhere, and this is very comprehensive, a lot of the policies too also say, or the procedures also say the final, oh, my brain, it has been a long day. The final decision is the board's, I think is what was the model policy and everything like that. I think I saw that in here when I read it earlier today.
I believe that language is still there.
Yeah, I think I saw it too. I think I saw it too. In case it's not, that's I know that's in WASDA model policy, is especially in the procedure, is the final determination is the board's.
Yes, and it is in the language of, I believe, letter G. Hold on, let me pull this up.
Yeah, I thought I saw it.
It is in there. It's the last sentence. It says
Yep.
the board will then make recommendations accordingly in an effort to solve the complaint.
Yeah, but I think in general, yeah. The board will attempt to make a final resolution of the matter. Yeah, okay. I think it's in there. I think because that's one of the things about the WASDA procedure is that whoever the complaint is against, is the final recommendation of the board stands. They can appeal, et cetera, et cetera.
And it does lay out the appeal process to that
Yeah,
extent.
I see that. Yes, I see that. I see that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this, especially, looking at this today compared to listening yesterday. I know I said it from the dais. It's important that families who have experienced, their children have experienced things, they should have a way to, submit a complaint.
You're muted, Dr. Harmon. It's okay.
Okay. I said, thank you for that feedback. I'm glad we had the space to have that conversation. And like I said, it'll move forward as well in our final minutes together. This, interestingly enough, is our last pre-scheduled policy work session. You all participated in another type of meeting yesterday, and in that, for other reasons, we listed out all of the work that had been done on the board over the course of this year. What I've heard during this meeting is an interest to have a couple of conversations, two different conversations on continuing. One about some additional budget work in addition to what's already planned. And I think I would guess that it would be the board's intention to probably continue the policy work throughout the remainder of the year. I will say that our regularly scheduled, our work sessions prior to our regularly scheduled meetings are all taken for topics that are purposeful. But I do believe that Ms. Howley has been in contact with you all about possibly some additional time periods for additional topics. So I will say there'll be more to come about how they will flesh out and where we might be able to fit some additional policy work in there, as well as continuing the foundational value statement work around our budget. So I think with that, we have covered everything, not necessarily in the time allotments that I had in my head, but I was glad we were able to spend the time that the board felt was appropriate on the topics that were laid out. So thank you for that. And Dr. Watts, we are finished on this end with our agenda.
Thank you so much, team. I will turn it over to President Daniels for adjournment. President Daniels,
Thank you all so much for all of your hard work. It is appreciated. I know it's been a long time and lots of great information, and thank you so much for being so thorough in your answers to our questions. With that, we are adjourned. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. You guys take care.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good night.